So how is it that we build relationships? How is it that we work with people who are not like us? It's kind of hard to do, and one of the things that's required, as Lauren talked about before, is a willingness to learn about other people. But how is it that people learn? So I want to walk through some basic ideas from neuroscience, from psychology, and some actual practice about how we learn. Learning is really about forming memories. What it means to learn something is we walk into, let's say, a math classroom, and initially we don't know what happens when you add 2 and 2. And the point of the exercise is that if someone can show you some images or numbers and examples, and you walk out of the class with the memory that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's what learning is. Learning is about the creation of memories. The learning of creations can seem magical, and there's some magic to it, but there's actually some biology underlying it as well. And understanding the biology of learning can be really helpful in thinking about how to relate to people who are different than us. So in this section, we're going to focus on 3 key points. One is that human attention is extraordinarily limited. And what I mean by that is think for a moment about how limited you believe the human attention span is. So imagine what you think that quantity is. Now what I want to ask you to do is divide that by a large number. And what I'm going to tell you is you're now closer to the truth. Human attention is extraordinarily limited, and our brain plays a lot of tricks on us to hide from us just how limited our attention is. This really matters when we're trying to talk to people because we just can't say anything. Most of the time people are going to ignore pretty much everything we say. They're going to forget everything they paid attention to, and they're not going to use what little they remembered. That's not because they're bad, it's because they're human beings and that's how we roll, right? So when we want to try and build communicative relationships with people, the question is how do we break through? So one thing we have to understand is attention. We also have to know that competition is everywhere. Lauren talked about competition from cell phones, social media, but even when you're in a room, like in a classroom, there are other people, there are other chairs. You can think about what you had for dinner, what you're going to have for breakfast. There's all types of things competing with whatever it is someone might be saying. How do you say something so that people want to pay attention to you as opposed to what's for dinner or, in some cases, a cat video? And then the final point is about how learning works. The key thing to know is that learning requires co-production. So one of the things I'm going to teach you that you might be surprised about is I actually can't teach you anything. What I can do is try and create a circumstance where you want to teach yourself. But we'll get to that in a moment. So when people think about learning, they usually have a theory. And the theory is that there's a thing called truth, and that if we just say truth in the right way, it will go into the brains of the people in our audience and they will walk away with the truth. And that's how learning works. So if we just tell people our opinion, they'll learn it. And if we shout it or write it in all caps, they'll learn it better. Okay? So if you remember one thing about what we're going to do in this segment, it is that that is so far from how learning actually works. Right? How we learn, how we form memories comes through a very different process. So let's talk about that. Everything you know, everything you feel, everything you recognize is a manifestation of physical and electrochemical relationships between objects like these. These are neurons. They're the basic building blocks of the brain. When you see a red object and you determine that it's a wagon, that's because networks of these objects that recognize red fire impulses to other neurons that have concepts like wagon. And when they co-fire, you have an association. You see the red thing looks like something that's a wagon. I'll realize that it's a wagon, right? What learning requires is actually growth between and amongst objects like this. So what it means to learn at a biological level is some fuel goes upstairs from the rest of your body, like in a way like adrenaline. It goes up to your brain and it makes some of these objects grow. It can make them grow longer or wider. And what it means when an object like this grows longer or wider, it means that something you see is associating with something that you already know and helping a memory form. So if we walk into a classroom and we don't know what 2 plus 2 equals, and then we see these examples, the concept 4, and that 4 relates to 2 plus 2, we start making these associations that 2 plus 2, 4, 2 plus 2, 4. And if we see enough of these examples, we can leave the room humming that tune. Oh yeah, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And now we have a new memory, and it's ours. That's how learning works. Okay? So once we know that, some really interesting things become possible in terms of what we can teach people. Right? So brains are amazing. So here's an amazing thing a brain can do. Like, look at that. Right? So the interesting thing is your brain looks at that and it tells you right away what it is. It tells you where you should walk and what you should run away from and what you should eat and what you should climb. And you don't even have to think about it. It just emerges automatically. Brains are amazing that way in helping us categorize things. And we go through most of our lives not thinking about what we see. We get the sensation of just knowing what we see. Oh, look, a tree. Oh, look, a branch, right? So our brains are great at that. But there's some things that our brains are not as good at, okay? So here's a question. How many trees are on this screen? Right? That's harder, right? How many trees are on this screen? I'll give you a second. You can try and count if you want. Okay. I actually know exactly how many trees are on the screen because I've seen this talk before. But also, I know something else about this image that will become apparent in a second. All right, anybody have a guess? How many trees?
15.
15. All right. So here's the exact number of trees. There are no trees on this screen. Okay. All there are, if you come up close, are millions and millions of tiny little pixels. And just because I didn't cheat, there are no trees back here either, right? But your brain, our brains, made us believe that there's a tree right here. But there's actually no tree at all. There's just millions of tiny little dots. And our brains turn them into a tree. So I mentioned before that I can't teach you anything. And I'm going to tell you why. When I give a presentation like this, I only have 2 tricks. Well, I have the tree trick, but I have 2 other tricks. I can make variations in sound, like I'm doing now, and I can make variations in light, like this, or by showing images. Those are the only things I can actually do in a presentation. To the extent that you hear anything that sounds like a word, or you see anything that sounds like an image, all of that was recreated between your ears and slightly above, right? Your ears can't hear words. Your ears only hear variations in sound. Your brain can't see, your eyes don't see a tree, they just see variations in light. All that feedback comes in and it's reconstructed in terms of meaning, right? So that's an amazing thing. So as we think about how we could talk to someone else and get their attention in a form of memory, now the trick is, how do we vary light and vary sound in a way that they'll want to process it, in a way that they'll want to think, how is this variation in light and sound relevant to me? Like, that's both the magic of learning, but it makes it a little difficult, right? But everything we learn, everything I'm saying right now, if you hear a word, it's because you reconstructed the word, right? The only things the things that are floating through the air right now, the sound waves, they're just variations in sound. They're not actually words. I mean, so what do we do with this? Like how do we think about learning? It opens up some really great possibilities, right? So as we think about what people can learn, let's go back to those attention limits. Psychologists, and we have a couple psychologists in the room, have studied a lot about attention, and here's one way to think about it. The number of things that we can hold in our brain at a single time, it can be conveyed by the number 7 plus or minus 2. This number comes from psychology studies in the 1950s that dealt with reading comprehension. So what is the currency here? What's 7? So it's a really technical term. It's called a chunk. It's a chunk. And in psychology, a chunk is things that you can think about without thinking about it. So if I say a word and like an image or images come to mind, and you don't have to think hard to make the images come to mind, that's like one chunk, all right? So I'm going to say something now, like search for something I'll say. I'm going to say Steph Curry. Steph Curry, okay? So I don't know if you guys know Steph Curry, but Steph Curry is a basketball player. Many people, with all due respect to LeBron James, many people think that Steph Curry is the best basketball player right now, and his team has won many of the recent championships. Steph Curry is really amazing. He has changed the game of basketball because he can make baskets from all over the place. I think he can make baskets from anywhere in an arena, but he can certainly make it from like anywhere on the court. And because he can make baskets from so far away, he's changed how teams have to defend him, and he works on a team where they do passing now because a lot of them can hit these shots. Anyways, so I say Steph Curry, and some people think about how good looking he is and all the endorsements he does and all the great plays he makes and the championships, and other people like, what? Like, I've never heard of this. Actually, some people, when I say Steph Curry, they probably think, is it spicy? Would I like it with Papadom, right? I mean, but the point is, whatever comes up in your mind when you hear something, that's like one chunk. And so now our attentive capacity, as measured by these studies, is we can keep 7 plus or minus 2 of these things in mind at any time. So this is interesting when you're like talking to other people. If you're like paying attention to what I'm saying right now, that's great. Thank you so much. But it's competing in your mind with what I'm saying right now. So if I were to tell a joke about pumpkins and strawberries, and you were thinking a lot about pumpkins and strawberries, and you were thinking a lot about all the different ways that you could organize pumpkins and strawberries on a table, it would be very hard to even hear what I'm saying next, because so many of your chunks would be thinking about maybe there'd be 2 pumpkins and 3 strawberries, maybe one would fall off the table, like all of the things you could think about. So I don't know if you guys are ever going to give a PowerPoint presentation. Have you heard the concept death by PowerPoint? Right. So here's one place that comes in. If you have a PowerPoint, you have lots of words on it. Because people's attentive capacity is so limited, you're making everyone in your audience make a choice. That is, read the words on the screen or listen to you. But attention, the limits of attention are so brief that they can't do both. Right. So just something to remember. But this also is effective in other ways. Think about expertise. So imagine that there's a chessboard and a novice and an expert come to play chess. The question is, does one person have more chunks than the other? And the answer from a psychological perspective is no. The answer is what's different between a novice and an expert is what's in their chunks. So many chess experts have been interviewed. How do you see a chessboard? How do you think about the game? And for many chess experts, they can walk up to a board and even without thinking about it, they can see their first 5 moves. They imagine what the opponent's going to do and they just automatically see it. Whereas a novice like myself would walk up to a chessboard and say, oh, look, a horse, 2 horses, right? And then I might have to need a book. I might need a book to figure out, well, what do I do with the horse? What do I do with the thing that looks like a castle? What do I do with the thing that you're calling a queen, but it doesn't look like a queen? Like, for me to construct even one move, I'd have to think about it a lot. And if somebody tried to talk to me while I'm figuring out where to move the horse, it would be very difficult. Whereas the expert could do it automatically because they've already seen the moves, right? So you can't change the number of chunks. This is a limit. This plus or minus 2 that you want to, a lot of it has to do with adrenaline. So I'm not the most athletic person. So some people who are very athletic, they remember a sports game where I was playing basketball and the net looked that big and everything went in. That's like Steph Curry's life. You know, for me, it always looked like a thimble. But for some people, you know, there's a moment where the net looks really big, or you know, you're sort of you're so focused that everything seems to be moving slowly. That's like when your attentive channel is really big. But sometimes you're really tired, and maybe you're watching TV, you're watching Netflix or something, and someone comes in the room and they start talking to you, and you know they're making noises, but you can't hear what they're saying. That's kind of like 7 minus 2. That's your attention is so limited that you can't really make out the words. Just like I'm watching a movie and you can't do it. So adrenaline has a big effect on how much you can pay attention, but attention is always really limited. So this matters now because when we're trying to form a relationship with someone, when we're trying to listen to or say things to people, no matter how great your idea is, no matter how good your intentions are, biology doesn't change the limits for any of us. All right. So how do we get attention? How do we do this? And there's 3 basic ideas. So the first thing is we have to have immediate relevance to core concerns. So the way I like to think about this is every day all of us are on a journey, right? There's something that we want. There's some place that we're going. There's some goal that we're trying to achieve or some anxiety that we're trying to relieve. If you and I encountered somebody and we knew what their journey was and we could find the relationship between what we wanted to talk about and a person's journey, right? That person would be interested in what we're saying. So how do you find the intersection between what you want to talk about and what that person really needs? You know, if we had these machines, and maybe someday we will, that could record what we think about when we're walking in a hallway by ourselves or when we're going to sleep at night or when we first get up, right? And those are the core things that are sort of occupying our lives. Then if someone comes up to you and says, I have a way to help you with this thing you're trying to do, we'd be interested in that. And that's like the kind of information we like. So the key thing for all of us when we're trying to communicate with others is, can we find that? A lot of times people are in advocacy mode. That is, I'm going to sell you something, and I'm going to tell you how great I am or how smart I am. And I think most of us know that when someone approaches us like that, unless there's absolutely nothing else for us to do, we sort of want to get away, right? Unless this person happens to be selling us something that we want. But it's a little better when someone walks up to you and they're kind of like, how are you? And the conversation is not just about them, it's about, you know, maybe them trying to help you, or at least it goes 2 ways. If we can find ways to take what we're thinking about and put it in forms that help other people take the next step on their journey, we're more likely to have an audience and to break through the barriers of attention. Another thing is consistent with values. So here's the thing that's just true about all of us. We don't like to be threatened. So if someone walks up to you and they're like, you're wrong, or even if they don't do this, but it's pretty clear that what they're saying is you're wrong, a lot of what we do internally is we counter-argue. We're like, okay, like we're nodding as if we agree, but really we're looking for a way to get out of the situation. If you threaten someone's values, they tend to listen a little better. And if you want to run an experiment like this at home, like I don't know your political parties, but the question, if you are left of center politically, and I asked you to watch Fox News tonight, Could you do it with an open mind? Could you say, well, tonight I'm just actually going to think about Tucker Carlson and whether he's right about things? Like a lot of people who are left of center, forced to watch Tucker Carlson, they have like a physical response. And the same thing for conservatives who are forced to watch Rachel Maddow, right? It's just when people are somehow threatening your values, it's harder to hear them because we spend a lot of time trying to distance ourselves from them. If you want to talk with someone who's not like you, a key thing is sharing their values. I had an experience once in Aspen. I was at a big event with scientists and religious leaders. And there was this point at which leaders of several religious groups asked me, how would I do a sermon on climate change, right? I have no training in theology, but I said I wouldn't. And he said, why would that? Well, what would you do? And I said, well, do you have a sermon on stewardship of God's creation, right? He was from a theological tradition where I knew that was a thing. Could you give a sermon where you talked about shared responsibility for all the things that God has created, right? And then at the end of the sermon, instead of at the beginning saying, hey, we're going to talk about climate change, which would confuse people in a church, and particularly if it was a right-of-center church, people were like, why are you politicizing the sermon, right? You could say, we're going to talk about being responsible for all the things that God has created. And at the end of that sermon, when everybody realizes this is who we are and that's why we're together, and then you say, well, that includes the environment. And now let's talk a little bit about, our role in the environment. That might be a way to get your congregation to be just willing to have the conversation a little more. You don't want it, it's not about changing their values, it's just about validating who they are. If you threaten people's values, they don't want to listen. If you validate people's values, you've got a chance. The final thing is actionable. As I pointed out before, my background's in mathematics, and math has to do a lot with abstractions. In our daily lives, we have so much that we want to do. Abstractions are sometimes, we don't have time for them. We just want to know, like, what can we do? Like, how do I solve my problem right now? Like, how do I find a good place to eat? Or how do I get a better job, or whatever it is? If we can figure out ways, again, to take the things that we want to talk about and turn them into things that people can do, we're more likely to get attention. So if we talk about things that help people on their journey, that don't threaten them or that validate them, and that they can actually work on, we're much more likely to get attention, even though attention is really hard to get, right? So there's a sweet spot that I like to talk about when a way to think about how do we approach another person and build a communicative relationship. One, are we talking about things that relate to their core values? Are we, in a sense, validating the other person at the beginning, as a way of getting their attention? And then finally, are we giving them things that help them take their journey? Are we telling them things where they're like, hey, that actually works. You actually get me. You actually understand what I'm trying to do. Can I learn more from you, right? If we are at the intersection, if we are doing both of these things at the same time, we're much more likely to get attention than if we're talking about ourselves or we're giving people information that's kind of useless, all right? So suppose we get somebody's attention. One of the other big challenges is the idea is forming memories. And I have a secret to tell you about memory. Memory fades. So you guys are all college students, right? Think about the best lecture you ever saw in a college class. How much do you actually remember about it? For the typical person and the typical best lecture I've ever seen, if you have more than like 30 seconds of individual memories, that's a lot. Usually what people remember is kind of a feeling and maybe what it was about, but unless you just watch the video, that's all you remember. And I don't know what the most important day of your lives have been. At my age, it's like when I got married or, when my kids were born. But, unless you just watch the wedding video, most people don't remember a lot of things about their wedding day, even though they'll tell you it's the most important day of their lives. The thing to know about memory is that people will forget most of what you've said to them, right? And so when you're trying to put something out there, right, talking about what you want in ways that are central to what they want is critical to having them remember it. So when we talk about reaching out to someone's core concerns, if you really want to build a relationship and be remembered, it's not optional. We really do have to validate other people to build a relationship with them. Otherwise, we have to count on the fact that they're just not into us. So let's say we get all this right. Now I want to tell you how learning actually works. This will be the last step. So do you have a favorite song? Do you have a favorite song? Does anyone not have a favorite song? Okay, I'll have a favorite song. All right, so I want you to do me a favor. Can you close your eyes for a second and see if you can hear it? Okay? All right. So I'm going to tell you something about what you're hearing. I don't know exactly what you're hearing. We can cover that in the break. But what you're listening to isn't exactly your favorite song. Okay, and what do I mean by that? There are going to be some instruments missing. There are going to be some parts of the song missing. And have you ever seen one of these videos where people try and interpret what the lyrics of a song are? Yeah, we might have the lyrics wrong. Okay, so, but we remember the song and it's our favorite song. So what just happened? When we remember a song, it's because we have co-produced our own version, right? If we're in a car or we're at somebody's house and we hear the song and we're listening to the rhythm and we're sort of thinking about it and we're sort of blocking everything else out and like really interacting with the song so that when we leave the room we can still hear it, it's because we just wrote our own version of it. We just co-produced our own version. It's not the same as the one we heard. It has some of the same elements, but it's a little bit different. That's what learning is. When a student walks into a class and they walk out humming the tune, it's not really a tune, 2 + 2 = 4, they co-produced their own version of the math lesson, right? I can't teach you anything, right? But what I can do is create a circumstance where because information relates to core values, you're so interested in it that you create your own version of what happened in the lecture. And then it's yours, and then it's a memory. Right? That's how learning works. And so if we want to reach out to people who aren't like us, that's the key, right? And it's not the key because I want it to be that way. Yeah, I'd like it a lot better if people just did everything I said, right? But biology sets some really hard and fast rules. And the rules are attention's really, really hard to get, and people aren't going to work hard at thinking what you're saying unless they kind of want to hum. They're so inspired by your tune that they want to hum it and create their own version. That's how learning works, right? So again, the principles of this idea: human attention is extraordinarily limited. That's true whatever we want to do. Competition is everywhere, so we really have to reach people where they are, and learning requires co-production. If we keep those things in mind, we can have some great opportunities to do some wonderful things for people. We have great opportunities to form new relationships with people that we didn't know before by forming a new level of trust and a new level of understanding.